All
Okay.
right. Okay. Now, welcome to today's panel about 1821 Greek revolt and its relations with the great powers. And I hope these panels will continue anyway. Today we have very distinguished three scholars to talk about Greek independence, 1820s, and the great power politics. Our first speaker is Dr. Patrick Walsh. Dr. Pat Walsh graduated from Queen's University and got his degree from politics and sociology and still teaching. And among his prominent works, the Great War, Ottoman Empire's position in Great War, the Armenian issue in the first quarter of the 20th century, and he's an expert on also Ottoman 19th century. The floor is yours, Dr. Walsh. You are going to talk about Greek independence, or it's a fiction or non-fiction. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to talk really about the experiences of Greece in the First World War. And because this was a sort of test of Greek independence, whether it was really fact or fiction. And it arose really with regard to the British desire to get Greece to join the First World War. And, basically to fight Ottoman Turkey at the end of the day. In January 24th, 1915, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, formally requested the Greeks enter the Great War. And he offered vague promise of important territorial concessions in Asia Minor in return for Greek military assistance in the Balkans and against the Ottomans. So Britain tried to draw Greece into the Great War on irredentist grounds, for territory. Now, Basil Thompson of the British Intelligence Services and later Scotland Yard, he later wrote a book called The Allied Secret Service in Greece, and he describes the political situation in Greece at the start of the European war in these terms. He said, Greece was in a state of internal peace, which has been rare in her history. In 1913, she had emerged victorious from 2 consecutive Balkan wars in which her king had led her so successfully in the field that her territory had been greatly enlarged. But our people were war weary, and since the quarrel between Austria and Serbia seemed in no way to concern them, their feeling was for a neutrality benevolent towards England and France. So what happened was the Greek king Constantine, he politely refused Britain's offer, and he determined to remain neutral in the war. But Britain was determined to enlist as many neutrals as possible in the war. So what happened subsequently was they attempted to circumvent the king and his people by making offers to the Greek prime minister, Venizelos, of territory in Anatolia. Right from the outbreak of the Great War, Venizelos argued for an unqualified and unconditional Greek entry into the war on the side of the Entente. He'd been an insurrectionist in Crete, and he wanted to use the war to advance Greek interests against Turkey, and he seems to have been made aware of British plans to extend the conflict to the Ottoman Empire, even though it was still neutral at this point. Okay, so Churchill had formed a plan to involve the Greek army in a naval attack on the Dardanelles early, before Turkey had actually joined the war. And it seems to have been communicated to Venizelos, okay? So Venizelos believed Greece would never again be presented with such an opportunity like the European war, the chance of fighting with so many powerful allies to gain a greater Greece in Asia Minor. He had his ultimate dream, the Megali idea, a large Greek empire across the Balkans and Asia Minor, and a new Byzantium. The problem was the king. The king Constantine, under the Greek constitution, had the final say in matters of war and peace. So he attempted to defend a neutrality policy. Now, Constantine, his background, he was a trained military man, and he saw a Greek adventure in Anatolia as very unwise. And he listened to the military advice of his chief of staff, the famous General Metaxas, who basically said this was going to be a disaster if they tried to do it. He'd made a report during the Balkans Wars, and he had advised against Greece doing any such thing. So essentially what happened was Constantine took the advice of his chief of staff, and he informed the Entente that there should be a policy of benevolent neutrality, and he would not fight Turkey unless Greece itself was attacked. So this was really essentially the background to what happens and about Greek neutrality. Now, the Entente started investigating the actual, what they saw was the constitutional position of Greece. This is the interesting thing. And they suggested they had the right to interfere in the internal affairs of Greece due to the Treaty of London, 1863-4, between England, France, and Russia on the one hand, and Greece on the other. This recognized the independence of Greece, but now it was claimed that it was also entitled the guarantors of that independence to interfere in this independence. So England actually had a long history of interference in the affairs of the Greeks and regarded this interference as a matter of routine. And they charged a man called Ronald Montague Burrows, who was professor of Greek and professor of King's College London, with the sort of academic the academic foundation of a policy. So he wrote in the New Europe, which was a magazine which was designed to reconstruct Europe after the war. He wrote this: "As we created Greece at Navarino, so we recreated it in 1863, and the letter of the original guarantee must be construed in the spirit of the Treaty of 1863 and of the interference in the internal affairs of Greece, which that treaty crystallized." So he was arguing that treaties gave Britain the right to actually interfere in Greek independence. Burrows was the advisor on Greek affairs to the British cabinet, and simultaneously actually to Venizelos as well during 1915. The Encyclopedia Britannica, for instance, says about Burrows, he taught at the University of Manchester and was principal of King's College London from 1913 to 1920, the period in which he devoted much time to modern Greek affairs. His plan for bringing Greece into World War I was adopted by the British cabinet in 1915. A confidant and advisor to the Greek statesman Venizelos, he was chosen to be Greek Provisional Government's semi-official representative in London in 1916. So he was an important figure. Greece, basically, the argument that Greece was made in England, and as a consequence, it was England's right to do with Greece what it wished. In 1832, the Greeks had wanted a liberal republican state, but they had been straitjacketed by a monarchy, complete with foreign king, by the guarantors, who at that time, not long after the French Revolution, did not want to promote liberal democracies in Europe. So the Greek king, to a great extent, was the representative of the three great powers of Europe, because his position was derived from their power over Greece. And they were always inclined to believe he should be their instrument. And if he wasn't, he shouldn't be king. So Professor Burrows referred to the fact that the Greek king Otho had been forced into accepting a constitution by Britain. And when he had refused to abide by it, he had been deposed in 1862. In 1863, England put Prince William of Denmark, father of King Constantine, on the throne of Greece and defined the political status of the Greek state as a monarchical, independent and constitutional state in a treaty with Denmark. So interestingly, at the time of the Crimean War, Greece under King Otho was in favor of going to war with Turkey on the side of Russia. But France and England, who were in alliance with Turkey against Russia, would not allow it. So King Otho was told that strict neutrality was the only policy that Greece could have. The Allies landed troops in Athens to actually compel obedience to their will. and the Greek sovereign was put on notice for daring to adopt an independent Greek policy. So there was great history about, interfering in Greek affairs, even though it was supposedly independent. Professor Burroughs, who regarded the Greek state as a creation of England, urged the British government to keep up this tradition of interference, which he argued had been given formal status in international treaty. The liberal daily newspaper, the Daily News, concurred, and it declared in its leader of June the 23rd, 1916, that because England had freed the Greeks at Navarino, drafted their constitution, and became the country's guarantor, it was warranted in taking any measures for the protection of their ward. A ward is a kind of young, immature figure who needs to be guided in the right direction by those more responsible who are charged with his protection. So that was the sort of scenario. Both Burroughs and another man, Compton Mackenzie, famous British intelligence officer, famous novelist, wrote the novel Whiskey Galore. They were in favor of the British government recalling the ambassador and declaring open support for Venizelos against King Constantine. But the Prime Minister, Asquith, was for intervention in Greece if a popular movement existed that Britain could point to in order to justify intervention. Lloyd George, the future Prime Minister, was of the opinion that Venizelos needed British might to be applied to the general region in order that a popular movement against the king could be cultivated to swing the Greek people behind him. Now, Edward Grey, unfortunately for Venizelos, was paralyzed by his reliance on the Tsar and because of the military encirclement of Germany. And he didn't want to go along with the French. The French wanted direct military action to coerce Greece, but Grey was mindful that to encourage a revolutionary movement against the King of Greece might be much resented by the Emperor of Russia and might in consequence have unfavorable influence on British-French relations with Russia. So he hesitated. So what happened instead, what they did is instead of direct military pressure, they put a Pacific blockade on the Greeks. And that was basically a way of trying to blockade them into coming into the war. The Daily Telegraph said the Greeks needed to understand that their position is strength, not too refined in character, and a downright masterfulness, which is first cousin to brutality. Greece must be under no illusions as to her position. If she chooses to oppose our projects, and must be fully aware that a blockade would be ruinous to our trade, to our shipping, and above all to our corn supplies. Now, Roger Casement, the famous Irishman who'd worked under Grey in the British Foreign Office, he wrote in the Continental Times, Byron came to aid Greece in the War of Independence. Now the countrymen of Byron today are doing their utmost to plunge Greece into the war. If Byron could say in his day, 'tis Greece, but living Greece no more, his fellow countrymen today are assuredly determined that the strict fulfillment of the poet's word shall come to pass. Not content with occupying Greek territory and marching large forces through it in defiance of the protest of its government, these friends of Greece and of small nationalities proceed to assail the very existence of the country they have lawlessly invaded and threaten with everything short of open acts of war if it will not aid their projects. So basically then you had a discussion between Professor Burroughs, Compton Mackenzie, and Sir Edward Carson, who was the famous lawyer and the leader of the Unionists in Ireland and a British cabinet minister, later First Lord of the Admiralty. And basically, Carson wanted the British forces to be landed in Greece and essentially the Greeks to be cajoled into the war. There was a disastrous Battle of Athens in December 1916 when a large force of French and British troops were landed, but the Greeks managed to fight them off. And this was highly embarrassing. But after this, the British threatened Constantine with basically flattening Athens with the Royal Navy, and he had to concede to certain demands, like replacing the chief of staff of the police and of demobilizing the Greek army. In response to this, the Greeks acquiesced in the demands, and the Allies lifted the blockade of Greece. And then there was a general election, which was demanded by the Greeks, by the British on the Greeks. And essentially this was held in September 1916. So the Greeks were given an open choice between neutrality and war. On November 19th, 1916, the British announced a full blockade of Greece and demanded the withdrawal of British troops from Salonika and the handing over of road and rail networks in the area and supply bases in Greek territorial waters. The Royal Navy blockade of Greece was designed to force Greece into the war or else bring about a regime change in which Venizelos replaced the king. But the blockade failed initially because the people stood by the king, and basically the British were forced into the idea of regime change. So in May 1917, the British and French decided on a three-stage program to ensure Greek entry into the war. It was agreed that there would not be a direct military coup, but what they decided to do was seize the wheat crop of Thessaly, upon which the entire Greek population depended for bread, and the Corinth Isthmus, cutting off the Greek army from the capital. And they delivered an ultimatum to Constantine demanding the immediate entry of Greece into the war. And it was decided that direct force would then be applied to the situation in Athens if Constantine refused to comply. So just coming to the end now. The king decided to save his people by sacrificing his throne on the 11th of June, 1917. There were scenes of turmoil in Athens as large crowds tried to prevent the king's departure. But Constantine was left with no alternative, and he urged his people to remain calm and resolute in the face of the invasion forces at Salonika. The Allies treaded carefully due to events in Russia. They would not allow a republic, but they would not have Constantine's eldest son, Prince George, as replacement for his father either. So Prince Alexander, the young second son of Constantine, which they thought would be more malleable, was given the throne. Venizelos entered Athens with the French army, and Greece formally joined the war on the Allied side. To sum up then, that was the start of the Greek tragedy. For the following 5 years, Greece was used as a cat's paw to impose a punitive settlement on the Turks. It appears that although Greece had won its independence in 1821, this independence was conditional on the interests of the great powers that had assisted it, particularly Great Britain. Greek sovereignty was also something which was far from an established fact. Greece was, a century after independence, very much viewed as an instrument to be used in geopolitics and war. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh, for your very enlightening discussion about legal and political basis of the Greek intervention into the Turkish liberation war. And we understand that indeed Greece, from the very beginning, from 1821, 1822, 1827, was conditionally accepted as an independent state there, independent monarchy there. Can I ask one question depending on my role as moderator?
No problem, yes.
All right, thank you very much. Indeed, as you know, in 1822, still when this Greek revolt was going on, there was a meeting in Nauplion among the rioters indeed. The Greek intelligentsia, some representatives from this Heteria organization and some Phaneriot people got together, and I mean, it didn't live long, but they agreed on a constitution over there in 1822. And as far as I know, there were, yes, like the members of Philike Heteria, there were some people that defend independence of Greece, and there were some others that agreed on an independent Balkans, of which a part of Greece, and then there were some people, especially from Istanbul, like Mr. Mauro Cordato, as you know, which never indeed defended Greek independence among this, I mean, between these constitution debates anyway. From the very beginning, what do you think, what would be your comment about the people within the Greek revolt about their ideas on independence?
Well, it seems to be that, you know, the Greeks were, to me, reading from what the British were talking about, the Greek viewpoint 100 years later, seems to me the Greeks, a lot of the Greeks wanted a republican type of constitution and, you know, a real sort of substance of independence. But, you know, the great powers were determined not to let them have this. They were determined to impose a particular state upon them and to dictate who their leaders actually were. And they imported kings from other countries to sort of rule them, which was a very sort of strange form of independence to have foreign monarchs imposed from, I mean, obviously it was something that was done in Europe in past centuries to other states, but you know, this was like the modern nationalist era, and yet the supposedly democratic era in a lot of respects. And the Greeks were not allowed to follow this path. They were, as I think I explained, their sovereignty and their independence was very conditional on the interests of the great powers, particularly Great Britain, who had regarded themselves as the creators of Greece, or the new Greece. And of course, Greece was very much a thing in the British public schools. It was a very important inspiration to the British Empire. And so they almost felt like they were recreating a great Greece, but within the ambit of the British Empire sort of thing and its interest. That's what I think anyway.
All right, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very analytical and good. Thanks a lot. Our second speaker is Dr. Maxim Gawin. Dr. Maxim Gawin did his master's, get his master's degree from Université de Sorbonne, and then he got his PhD from Middle East Technical University, History Department in Ankara. And Dr. Gawin worked on the early 20th century Ottoman Empire, the Armenian issue, the ethnicities, and 19th century Ottoman political history. So today, Dr. Gawin will talk about the wars of Greek monoethnicity within 100 years span, as far as I understand.
Yes, exactly.
So the floor is yours, Dr. Gawin.
Thank you very much. In this presentation, I will present characteristics, some important characteristics of the Greek revolt, what is often called Greek War of Independence, and its legacy until 1922, mostly from the perspective of ethnic cleansing and conception of what is Greek ethnicity, Greek nationality, showing the continuity, but also the differences in this long-term perspective. For reasons of time, my presentation will focus on the three main conflicts of this kind: the Greek revolt of 1820s, the Balkan Wars, and the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922. I will not discuss in detail the issue of Crete, and I will not treat the question of the Albanians expelled from Greece in 1944. And anyway, if it was in the context of a war, it was not a war launched by Greece. It was the Second World War. So my presentation will have three parts: one of the 1820s, one about the Balkan Wars, and one about the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922. So my first part. I will not repeat what Dr. Walsh said, but I must start with the importance of securing international support. The Greek independence, with or without quotation marks, even against a weakened Ottoman Empire, would have been unthinkable without a foreign support. Namely, we saw the Russian push towards the Free Seas particularly the Mediterranean Sea. And the Romanticism, seeing the war as a fight of Christians against what was considered by them as a Muslim oppression. And also in a context where Romanticists, both in France and Britain, oppose Greece to Roman classicism. Greece, ancient Greece, or the myth they developed regarding ancient Greece was a much more interesting model for Romanticism than Roman ancient times. And this was, in France and Britain, one of the very first cases of press campaign, and one of the very first cases, as far as I know at least, where religion was used by people who were not religious at all. The people who criticized in the 1920s or later observed that a large part of especially in France, of the people who supported Greece in the name of Christianity attended perhaps two religious ceremonies in their whole life. That having been said, it is a fact that many volunteers, I will treat this issue in a minute, many volunteers were more than disappointed, and as well as sailors who intervened in 1827. For example, Captain Pujol in 1827 wrote that he arrived very pro-Greek, but now is very against them. Quote, "They are without patriotism, without courage, without union," unquote. Franz Lieber, who was a German volunteer, was even more strident. And another German volunteer named Bollmann called the Greek insurgents barbarians, considering what they did to Muslim civilians. And one of the most famous British volunteers, Colonel Gordon, resigned because of the crimes of the insurgents. And precisely, this external support was even more important in the 1820s than in the later conflicts, because Greece did not exist purely and simply at that time. So there was no state tradition, there was no military tradition anymore. All these ancient and Byzantine tradition had been completely forgotten and anyway completely irrelevant at the beginning of 19th century. That's why the methods of the Greek insurgent were very close to pure and simple banditry without strong organization, and the foreign officers played a major role in the Greek military victory, as well as, it is well known, the British and French fleets in 1827. And this was actually a kind of abuse of religion, because the Catholic Greeks, especially in Izmir, were very against the independence of Greece and helped to, preferred to see a victory of the Ottoman Empire. So it is a transition to my second point of this first part, the eradication of the Muslim and Jews. If the expulsion of Muslims and Jews are not something completely new in 1821, because it has been practiced in Belgrade in 1807 at the very beginning of the Serbian independence movement, this is the first time that Muslims and Jews are annihilated, not only expelled, but wiped out from a rather significant part of the territory of the Ottoman Empire. Justin McCarthy, in his book Death and Exile, estimates the victims to 10,000 who have been expelled and about 25,000 who have been exterminated. But this is a minimal estimate, because, for example, Alfred Lemaitre, who compiled various testimonies and used archives of the French Ministry of Navy, estimates that it was 25,000 in March, April 1821 only. And there were other killings the same years in Tripolitza, for example, and François Pouqueville, who was one of the most pro-Greek observers of the conflict, says there were 8,000 males and a greater number of females who have been killed in this instance only. So that's why I consider that the figure of Saleh Soniel of 50,000 does not seem exaggerated. Perhaps we will have more accurate figures in the future, but at least I wanted to discuss a bit this issue. And precisely a large part of these victims, of the Muslim victims, were Greek speakings, were not ethnically Turkish. So there was a fight against the ones they considered to be Turks, but in practice there were not many who were really Turkish. So it was the beginning of the identification of religion to ethnicity, religion to political loyalty. And in this regard, the Catholics were not liked as well, and the Jews suffered the same fate than the Muslims and were completely annihilated from the small kingdom of Greece that emerged in 1830. Yet precisely from 1830 to the Balkan Wars, there was a kind of sedimentation of this anti-Muslim, anti-Turkish, and anti-Semitic feelings. The violence of 1820s, it is clear in most of the sources, contemporary sources, testimonies, archive, etc., was largely popular and spontaneous. The perpetrators were mostly illiterate. However, after 1830, in a more general context of Christian nationalism, but precisely this context was impulsed by Greece to a very large extent, there is a synthesis of anti-Muslim, anti-Turkish, and anti-Semitic feeling that is progressively built. As it is well known, in the 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire is a time of kind of epidemic for the blood libel, for the accusation that Jews use the blood of Christian children to make bread. It is not only the fact of Greeks, but the Greeks are overrepresented among the perpetrators of these attacks and among the people who spread this kind of slander. The affair in Izmir in 1901 is the best known, but it is far from being the only or the first one. And in the context when Abdulhamid used the caliphate for almost for the first time, but also in the context of Greek nation building, Greece was kind of failed state, but at least it was a kind of state. There was, as I say, a synthesis in the sense that during the reign of Abdulhamid, widely believed conspiracy theory was there are Jewish bankers behind Abdulhamid. Behind Abdulhamid is a quintessential Turk, and the Turk is a quintessential Muslim. And this idea was spread in Western Europe, for example, by a Frenchman of Greek origin who signed Kimon. We are not sure about his real name, but we know he was born in Greece, who developed that during the second half of 1890s. And this conspiracy theory became, after 1908, the conspiracy theory of the Jewish Masonic Dunmay plot behind the Committee Union and Progress. Very few people know that this conspiracy theory actually emerged during the reign of Abdulhamid and was not only due to the slander and the errors regarding the CUP. Also, there was an anti-Catholic dimension that I mentioned a little bit previously, but that reinforced during the whole 19th century. I think, among other reasons, because of the French support for the Ottoman Empire during the Crimean War, because of the friendship of Ambassador Maurice Bompard with Javid Bey, who was a Dunmay with all the conspiracy theory you can know and or not imagine, and also the appointment of Catholics to high position by Abdulhamid and by the CUP. Both Abdulhamid and the CUP actually supported the Catholic missionaries, considering that conversion of Eastern Christian to Catholic faith was good for public order and for loyalty to the state. And reciprocally, the converted Catholic, like the Muslims, like the Jews, considered the Ottoman Empire as a shell, as a protection against the intolerance of the schismatic churches. So now the second part of my presentation regarding the Balkan Wars starts with a general remark. Most of the Greek war crimes have been perpetrated by regular soldiers, which is completely different from the 1820s. These are not gangs. This is not in majority a popular violence. This is the fruit of orders, as I will demonstrate. There are much less irregulars in the Greek forces than in the Bulgarian and Serbian forces, for example. The main exception is when the Bulgarian officers distribute weapons to both Greeks and Bulgarians, civilians, to attack the Muslim and Jewish population in Ceres, for example. So who are the targets? Quite logically and quite in continuity with the 1820s, the non-Orthodox, so the Muslims, the Jews, and the Catholics. By far, the most numerous victims are Muslims because they represent the majority of the population. And precisely, the Balkan Wars are the first time when Greek expansionism and Greek ethnic cleansing target the majority. In 1820s, it was against the minority. With the conquest of Crete in 1890s, it was still against a Muslim minority. This time it's against the large majority of the population. So not unlike in 1820s in what is today the south of Greece, or in 1890s in Crete, killings, mass killings is used. For example, the Greeks took 195 Turks from all over the Casa of Pravista to the ravine of Kasrub, murdered them there, and left the body as witness of the deeds, which is from the Carnegie report, which is not the most pro-Turkish publication on these wars. And similarly, there has been plunder for weeks in Salonika, both against the Muslims and against the Jews. Or the destruction by fire of the Muslim quarter of Dedeaj near Edirne. And to quote a testimony in this regard, Monsieur Cazot, who had the Catholic seminary in today's Greece, it will be the ruin of the mission. For the moment in Macedonia, Greeks and Bulgarians behave like barbarians, including the indigenous Christians. Robberies, rapes, arsons, these are perpetrated against the Turks on a daily basis, which is clear. And anyway, when you want to wipe out the majority, often you use this kind of method. The Jews, as I said, are not spared, and the Catholic are molested, particularly when they try to help Muslims. And actually, a part of the data on the Greek and Bulgarian war crimes are provided by Catholic Greeks, because they know they will be less often killed because of the protection of France and Italy, but they knew they had very little hopes to nurture for the future, so they felt this kind of solidarity with the Muslims. And actually, the Catholics are not the only Christian targets. So this is my second point, the Orthodox targets, the Bulgarians. Paradoxically, the victory of Greece against the Ottoman Empire is largely, not to say mostly, due to the alliance with Bulgaria and Serbia and, of course, Montenegro. So this is a kind of reconciliation, a short-term reconciliation between states who, frankly, did not like each other before or after the First Balkan Wars. But this temporary alliance against the Ottoman Empire never prevented ethnic cleansing by Greece against Bulgarians and reciprocally by Bulgarians against Greeks. Some examples in this regard, letters published in the Carnegie report and all written in 1913. By, first quote, by order of the king, we are setting fire to all the Bulgarian villages because the Bulgarians burned the beautiful towns of Ceres, Niglita, and several Greek villages. We have shown ourselves far more cruel than the Bulgarians. I would like to stop here. This proves, of course, that ethnic cleansing was also practiced by Bulgarians, but Greek soldiers took pride in being worse than the Bulgarian soldiers and claim it is done by order. So one more time, this is not, at least from a Greek perspective, the fact of gangs of Chete, Komitadji, and so on. This is mostly the regular army that is in charge. Another letter also published in the Carnegie report. Here we are burning the villages and killing the Bulgarian, both women and children, end quote. So this proves that the level of violence against Orthodox, at least in some cases, was not lower than the level of violence against Muslims and Jews. And the last quote, we took only a few prisoners, and these we killed, for such are the orders we have received. I don't think a letter could be clearer than this letter, than this document. To finish with the issue of the Balkan Wars, with the aftermath, or exactly of the Balkan Wars. There is a Greek exception, in the sense that the Bulgarian ethnic cleansing was the bloodiest. These were the Bulgarian forces who killed the biggest number of Muslims in particular. But in 1912, 1913, exactly like in 1876, 1878, as soon as the demographic balance is changed, violence stops in the territories conquered by Bulgaria. I don't say the Muslims in Bulgaria experienced even, but it was clearly different from Greece, at least until the beginning of communist rule, which is a completely different period, and I will not tweet. The Greek ethnic cleansing kills less before 1919, but eliminates much more. The dream of monoethnicity is much clearer at that time in Greece than in Bulgaria or Serbia. And precisely, the campaign of individual assassination, torture, harassment, arbitrary arrest, and pure and simple expulsion of Muslims continues during the first months of 1914, something which does not happen in Bulgaria and Serbia, or even in Montenegro. It is true that one of the aims of the perpetrators is to resettle more easily Greek refugees from Western Thrace. It's true, but Bulgaria, for example, has also its own refugees. So this is not the main reason. The main reason is to have the smallest Muslim minority as possible. So I'm reaching the third and last part of my presentation, the Greco-Turkish War, what could be called paroxysmal violence and final defeat for Greek expansionism. Not Greek ethnic cleansing, but expansionism. So my first point, quite logically, will be the invasion of 1919, 1920. And one more time, the foreign support is essential. There are differences, of course, but foreign support made the Greek expansionists possible. And mostly the support of David Lloyd George, both ideologically and by his assessment of the British interest, which is not quite different from Dr. Patrick Walsh said. And it was justified by a campaign of fake news, as we will say today, regarding persecutions and threats against the Christians in Western Anatolia. The report of American, French, British, and Italian officers as early as 1919 has proved that there was no threats, no persecution, no killings of Christians in Western Anatolia during the first months of 1919, that the whole accusations were complete bogus. Yet, the Greek landings and the series of crimes that starts the very first day of the landing alienate to Greece, Italy, and a bit later, France, which is a major difference with 1820s. Because the crimes of the Greek insurgents were known in France and Britain as early as the 1820s. Several testimonies were printed, but it did not have a similar effect, at least in France. And still less in Italy, because Italy, as you know, did not exist at that time. So, and a last remark regarding the opinion and the state, at least in France, I think in Italy it's not quite different, but I shall speak about what I know in detail. At least in France, the state is involved in spreading data regarding the Greek war crimes as early as 1919. General Yunus, who was a member of the Commission of Investigation, clashed the Greek representative, and it was leaked in the French press openly. That having been said, in 1920, the invasion changed of nature because David Lloyd George knows that the British public opinion will never accept direct British intervention to impose the Sèvres Treaty, and as a result decides to use Greece as a proxy against the Turks, against the Turkish national movement led by Kemal Atatürk. And from the Greek side, it is perceived as occasion to obtain more than the Sèvres Treaty, because it is little known, but Sèvres was not considered in Greece as a great achievement. It was considered as unachieved, as something to be improved. And in 1920, many people felt it was an occasion. But the return of King Constantine in power at the end of 1920 finishes to make France an enemy of the new Greece, because King Constantine is the brother-in-law of Wilhelm Erzfeiter, of the German emperor. And King Constantine was personally involved in the murderous ambush of French sailors in December 1916. So he is hated from the communists to the far right, and nobody considers him reliable. And Italy finds with him new arguments to oppose Greek expansionism. Paradoxically, King Constantine won the elections in promising to stop expansionism, but quickly he becomes the loudest proponent of this very same expansionism, and he is supported by David Lloyd George and Lord Curzon as the only man able to continue this very expensive operation against the Turks. But all the offensives of 1921, January, April, September, failed one by one. And for the first time, a scorched earth policy is implemented, namely destroying the territories that is left, perhaps by imitation of the German methods. So I'm finishing with this war. During the first semester of 1922, the policy of extirpation of the Turks increases in spite of the Paris Conference of March 1922 promising to leave a full Turkish sovereignty from Izmir to Van. And I would like to say, because the Paris Conference promised that to the Turks. The hope was to put France and Britain in front of a fait accompli and to say, there is a Greek majority in Izmir, in this city and this city, so it must become part of Greece. Elzéar Guiffrey, who was the head of the French community in Izmir, estimated the Turkish civilian casualties to be in excess of 150,000 in July 1922, for example. But these dreams for Greece on both sides of Aegean Sea are collapsed completely with the quick defeat of summer 1922. During this retreat, as it is well known, the destruction reaches its climax. Lord St. David's on the British side, Camille Touray, who was an engineer on the French side, have well documented that. The International Red Cross has published a quite interesting report on this destruction. I have to skip. All that with the hope we could not build the Grand Greece, so we will leave only a desert to the Turks. And this will be my last remark. There is also a forced evacuation of the Christian population, Greeks and Armenians, by the Greek army, always with this idea, we will leave only a desert to the Turks because the Christians were overrepresented among the artisans and traders. So briefly in conclusion, after a century, the Grand Greece had eventually failed, but Greece was relatively close to monoethnicity. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Gawin, for your talk today. Then your remarks final remark is the creation of a mono-ethnic, monosectarian Greece, then became an expansionist state in terms of religion, in terms of ideology, and in terms of establishing this grand nation state, Greek nation state, about in and about 100 years.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. For the sake of saving time today, I'm going to go to our third scholar, Associate Professor Dr. Charladaria Thomas. Charla Thomas got her degree, BS degree, from Department of Modern Greek Language and Literature of Ankara University. And then she received her master's and PhD degrees from the Institute of Turkish Revolutionary History in Ankara University. And she still teaches there. Her thesis, PhD thesis, is Hellenism in Istanbul, Sociocultural Greek Organizations Early in the 20th Century. Today, though, she will talk about sociocultural structure of Greek community in Ottoman Istanbul in the 19th century. The word is yours, Dr. Thomas.
Thank you so much, sir. In this presentation, I will try to explain the general situation and social activities of Ottoman Greeks. But just before the main topic, I think it will be better to give a general information about the social structure of Ottoman Greeks, Ottoman state. Ottoman state was a multicultural and multi-religious empire, and a lot of non-Muslim communities were living in this country in addition to Muslim population. In 15th century, Mehmet II established a special system to govern this large population. And this system, which is called as millet system, is based on religion. According to millet system, Ottoman non-Muslim population divided into three groups: Greek millet, Armenian millet, and Jewish millet. The most crowded group in the system was Greek millet. Although the Greek name referred to a religion, Ottoman Greeks were in this group with all other Orthodox Christians. With this system, Sultan allowed all non-Muslims to create their own educational, social, and judicial systems. So Ottoman Greeks became the most privileged group, not only according to their living style, but also to the special tasks that they gained in the administration system of Ottoman state. They had very significant roles in the state. As I mentioned just now, Ottoman Greeks were the most crowded group, non-Muslim group. They were living chiefly in the coastline of the country, such as Istanbul, Izmir, or Black Sea region. And most of them were wealthy, well-educated, and merchants. They were speaking Greek language in addition to Turkish language. For education, they preferred foreign countries such as France and Italy. Also, Greek interpreters and their diplomatic privileges provided them to make free trade by mediation with European merchants, and this tradition developed Greek commercial bourgeoisie. While this was the case in Istanbul, it should be underlined that there is no serious aristocratic class among Anatolian Greeks, I mean in the center of Anatolia. However, if the part of the Greek population concentrated in Anatolia, especially in the coastal areas, dealing with trade and getting rich is excluded, the Greeks in general formed a large peasant mass. In the midland of the country, there were a great amount of Greeks who were Turkish speaking, but using Greek alphabet in their written language. This written language was called as Karamanlidika. So there was no common language unification among Greeks in Ottoman state. This was a cultural problem. In the process of nationalism ideology in the beginning of 19th century and afterwards, this became a very important and huge problem. The effect of French Revolution firstly began to be seen in multicultural and multi-religious empires, as we know, such as Ottoman state. So non-Muslims living in Ottoman country began to try to gain their independence. Of course, the connection of Ottoman Greeks with European countries helped them to acquire the awareness of nation and nationalism, and they started to find out the answer of who am I question. To find the answer of this question was so significant to establish a new nation, so that Ottoman Greeks living in the coastline of the country choose European countries for higher education, and they met with nationalism ideology. Then they discovered the question, who am I? And also discovered their past. To remember the past was important in order to recreate their independent existence. So that some kind of activities began about education. Education was preferred as the instrument to gain national identity, because according to Ottoman Greeks, only the education could connect the community. So the first movement began in one of the most educated regions of the state. The first region that Ottoman Greeks began for their social activities was Western Anatolia. Before the revolt, especially in Izmir, Greek community established some educational associations. Especially in this context, Izmir is at the forefront with social organizations characteristic that cannot be compared with other regions of Anatolia. The unique socioeconomic dynamics and advanced development of this city, which contributes to social transformation, paved the way for the emergence of a social dynamism among the Greeks of Izmir much earlier than the Greeks in the center of Anatolia. In this respect, the first Greek communities that emerged in Izmir can be regarded as the pioneer of socialization movement that spread both in Istanbul and Anatolia throughout the 19th century. Other important capital of Greek enlightenment in Anatolia was Ayvalık. Ayvalık was another important center in Western Anatolia for Greek community, and the Academy of Ayvalık was founded in 1804 and began to work about ancient Greek language to create a connection with the past. This was the most important step for the establishment of a national awareness. Also, the lecturers of Academy of Ayvalık had connection with European countries. In the first 20 years of 19th century, not only this intellectual interaction, but also the political support of great powers speeded up the Greek revolt, and in 1829, Greek kingdom established. In the years following its establishment, the independent Greek state started to work for its own educational institutions and then for Anatolian Greeks to gain their national awareness. The intellectual Greeks who implemented the first stage of national awakening with the establishment of Greek state now turned their attention to Istanbul and Anatolian Greeks, and they started to work for the Ottoman Greek community. These studies have been carried out through the groups acting on a voluntary basis and choosing Anatolia as their field of activity, as well as in the official dimension. So that a special movement called Association Movement began among Ottoman Greeks. This association movement, which began to develop in Ottoman Empire in the first half of 19th century, nominally with Tanzimat, considerably gained speed in the second half of the same century. The associational activities of Greek communities arose earlier than those of Muslims. The Ottoman Greeks, who had privileged position in Ottoman Empire, reorganized, especially in the fields of education and culture, as a result of Greek Enlightenment. And along with the associations they established in those fields, they both contributed to the expansion of Hellenism in Ottoman Empire and strengthened their community bonds. Educational institutions and practices in Greek states had a tangible impact on Ottoman Greeks, because the institutions where Greeks in Ottoman geography receive education were mostly primary and secondary schools. In this situation, directed many Ottoman Greeks to prefer Athens University for higher education after the establishment of Greek kingdom. The establishment of Athens University in 1837 should be considered as an important step in the establishment of Hellenic ideology. One of the most important channels of the awareness-raising program developed by the Greek state for the Ottoman Greeks was this university. The existence of Athens University provided Greek community of Istanbul to establish such an institution like this university in the modernization period of Ottoman state. So the modernization period of Ottoman state began with Tanzimat decree, created a very suitable atmosphere for development of Greeks. Especially acutely the idea of the period gave Ottoman Greeks a chance to develop their cultural levels. So that in this period, in 1861, Istanbul Hellenic Philology Community in Greek language, Elnikos Philologos Silogos Konstantinopoleos, another name I'm going to mention about this organization as Silogos from now on. This organization was founded and began to work as the Ministry of Education of Greek community in Ottoman state. Wealthy Greeks of Istanbul supported the association. Conferences were organized, books were published, and a common network is created among Istanbul Greeks. The only target of Silogos was to adopt Greek identity by education. After a while, the association movement in Anatolia began to be directed by this foundation, and the Greek schools, teachers, and all other organizations were organized by Silogos. Silogos also sent representatives to check the situation in the center of Anatolia, and these representatives prepared reports, and in the view of these reports, Silogos prepared new educational programs. Nominally, the language problem was the most important issue according to the association, because Greek language was significant for Anatolian Greek community to acquire their national identity. The main problem was that the community living in the center of Anatolia did not speak Greek language. Silogos also had connection with Greek government, and the teachers graduated from Athens University began to be sent to Anatolia to educate Anatolian Greeks. And the teachers began to teach Greek language to the population, Greek population in the center of Anatolia. New schools established, books were sent, and also new plans for education of female students were improved. Until Balkan Wars, the Greek associations tried to develop the cultural level of Greek community of Ottoman state, but according to the political targets of great powers, Greek associations began to be politicized and they changed their purposes. The foreign policy of Greece determined the political orientation of Ottoman Greeks. The organic connection between Greece and Ottoman Greeks affected the circumstance of Ottoman state in 20th century, and the internal destruction began in Ottoman state. In 20th century, Ottoman Greeks continued to make organizations in the same form, but the context and the topics of these organizations began to change. Nominally, the most important phase of this change began to be felt between 1919 and 1922. From Tanzimat period till National War of Turkey, more than 600 Greek associations were founded only in Istanbul. Most of them were educational, and rest of them were philanthropist, vocational, women, art and sport associations. But the common ground of these foundations were to keep together the Greek community and support their cultural and then political development. The idea that as the Greek language spread, the Greek national consciousness would develop, fed both Greek nationalism and the ideology of great idea. As a conclusion, although the great Greek struggle for independence or the Greek uprising was the first large national uprising supported by European intervention, it deeply shaken the multinational structure of Ottoman state. The establishment of the independent Greek state was determinant in the fate of Greeks in Anatolia in long term. The socio-cultural organizations in Ottoman state improved the relations of Greek community with great powers, especially during Balkan Wars and the First World War. Also, the Hellenism and the instrument of Hellenism, like Megalida, or in English, great idea, began to be developed in Anatolia and Istanbul. This development was supported by Greek state with the collaboration with Greek associations, so that the Anatolia, or in other words, the expansion geography of Greece, especially in the years between 1990 and 1922, began to be formed according to the political and ideological movement of Greece. The more the national awareness developed in this region, the idea of being Greek improved. So the regions where the Greek population lived began to be defined as Greek territory by Greece. The policy caused Greece to occupy Anatolia in 1919, and Greece claimed the regions in which Greek-speaking people were living as Greek territory. And this policy is supported by great powers. Thank you so much for attention.
All right, so much. Thank you very much. As far as I understand, from 1820s to 1830s, the revolt was always called as either Greek revolt or Morean revolt, as you know, especially in the Turkish literature, or Peloponnesian revolt. And in the very beginning, it was Eflak and Boğdan revolt by Alexander Ypsilanti. And I do not recall that it was called as Hellenic revolt anyway.
Yes.
That Hellenism and Hellenistic heritage of modern Greeks in the 19th century and early 20th century was something, as I understand, discovered by the European powers, and especially their, literary men like Lord Byron, or their authors, writers like George Finlay. Later, he never, called them as Hellenistic, then only he called Greek revolt. It was something discovered after everything happened, I think, as far as I know. What do you think about this?
Yes, especially the Enlightenment process after establishment of Greek state was very important, because in this process, some kind of problems inside of the Greek kingdom, such as language problem. For example, they began to discuss about which language are we going to use, ancient Greek or modern Greek or Katarevusta. So what is going to be the national language of this kingdom? They firstly wanted to solve this problem. And after that, slowly in this Enlightenment process, I think they discovered their national identity after the revolt. And of course, then they began to solve language problem. And as Pat mentioned in his presentation, King Otto was a very important symbolic figure in this process, because even though he was not Greek or Hellen, he always supported Hellenic identity, and he always supported Megalida. And for example, in architecture, he supported and he wanted to be built some kind of ancient Greek figure of architecture. And so slowly, a new Hellenic identity began to be established in the process of this Enlightenment, I think, until the first constitution of Hellenic Kingdom. So this is very important about finding the national identity, and this, of course, affected Ottoman Greeks, because after the Greek kingdom defined its identity, then they turned their face to Ottoman Greeks, because their problem was solved. And now the second problem was to provide Anatolian Greeks or Ottoman Greeks to find their identity, national identity. So according to my opinion, yes, you are right, Mr. Bostemur, because after the establishment of the kingdom or the state, slowly they wanted to solve problems one by one. Especially in the first stage of this revolt, I think, according to my opinion, they were not aware of their past. So they discovered their past after the revolt.
All right, thank you very much. Nationalism is something like this, either inclusive, as you mentioned, after Greek nationalism was established, then they wanted to include all other Greeks.
Yes.
In the Balkans, in Anatolia, in Western Anatolia, in the islands, Aegean islands, or as Dr. Gawin told us, it is exclusive. It is exclusivist, It's only Orthodox, doesn't want Catholics, doesn't want Jewish population, doesn't want other, minorities and ethnicities and sects within it. Nationalism is such a thing. All right, I would like very much like to thank you all for your participation, for your presentations, very analytical and nice presentation. I hope we can do these panels face-to-face, and this will be the first step, I think, for our discussions. Thank you very much, and have a good day, all you.
Thanks so much.
Okay.